Hello, and welcome to another Light Reading podcast. My name is Phil Harvey. I'm an editor here at Light Reading.
I'm Kelsey Zeiser. I'm also an editor at Light Reading.
And I'm Joe Cumello. I'm the SVP and GM of the Blue Planet division of Ciena.
Hey, Joe. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, happy to be here.
And we have a momentous occasion. It was 10 years ago this month. I think it happened early. It settled early in the month. But right. that Blue Planet became a part of Ciena. So you were there for the whole thing, or you've been there for a lot of it. Give us, for those of, I guess, a good place to start is kind of how it all happened. Like so the original company was called Cyan, Cyan, like the color. And then they had Blue Planet as a division, the software division, and it was bought for a cash and stock deal right around $400 million back in 2015. Right?
Yes.
2015.
Yeah, that's right.
And August of 2015. And
yeah, that makes 10 years, Phil.
I know. I just, I was just in a meeting where we were doing plans for future dates, and I was looking ahead to things, and I got kind of confused.
We're writers. We're not into the math.
That happens. Yeah. I guess a good place to start is sort of like something I've always kind of wondered is why Blue Planet never became a standalone company. It was always a software company of a bigger hardware company.
Yeah.
And then it became a software division of a bigger hardware company. And that always made me curious because it does seem to punch above its weight.
Yeah. Oh, it's a cool question. Well, I think if you go back a little bit and take a look at what was happening at that time period, I think that's where you start, because in 2012, we were in this sort of inflection point. The ETSI meeting had just happened in Europe. NFV was taking off. And Cyan, which was a sort of a packet optical vendor at the time, had a group of people in the organization who kind of had some passion or religion about what Netflix at the time had been doing with their microservices architecture, with their software architecture. And they said, well, what's another monolith in the world that could use that kind of software design to change the way it operates? And so those two things were happening at the same time. You had these microservices architectures, and you had the NFV movement and the SDN automation discussions going on at that time. And Cyan, had this group of people who said, why don't we try and tackle that monolith or that situation from a telco operations standpoint? And they came up with Blue Planet. And they funded that development through the packet optical business. Well, If you just sort of extrapolate out a little bit, what was Ciena at the time? What was a sort of massive optical business, right? Yeah. So when it looked at Cyan as a property, it saw two things. It saw an optical business that it couldn't consolidate, a packet optical business it could consolidate, and an organization that had a new technology that was on the cutting edge of software automation, which was an area of diversification, right? So those are the two things that came together, which sort of answer a little bit of your question. The second part of the question you said, which is interesting, is, well, why wasn't Blue Planet just a sort of separate business then? Well, if you look at the tie-ins of what Ciena does as a company or what Cyan did as a company, they both sold to very large network operators, right? Yep. And so creating diversification and deeper relationships with the customers benefits those organizations. And so that's why it sort of stayed within the house.
Mm-hmm. And can you talk a little bit about, why the acquisition made sense for Ciena at the time? We were talking offline about how software-defined networking and virtualization and NFV, that was all really escalating at that time. And, originally Blue Planet's strategy was to address network operator requirements for network management, control, and virtualization. So why did that make sense at the time, and how has that strategy evolved?
Yeah.
I know that was like 5 questions in one, so go.
All right. One,
no
two,
pressure.
No, take a nap. You guys keep going.
Yeah. See you later, Phil.
So if you look at where a CSP or a network operator spends a lot of their money, they're obviously buying lots of hardware to operate their network, but they also invest in a massive amount of software. And the cost of that operation is actually pretty high. There's a lot of manual processes in that. And they also have a large number of platforms in those processes. Some of them, if you're a large operator, can have hundreds of systems in your OSS and BSS, as an example. And so when you look at the business models that were being stressed at the time, so you have customer loyalty that had shifted to the cloud guys. Customers were viewing their lives, at the endpoints where you and I are sitting each day in our home watching TV. The customer trust was moving toward, well, what am I watching on TV, or what am I looking at my device, and that loyalty. So the service providers were saying, okay, well, how do I compete in that environment? How do I transition my business? And one of the areas was, how do I sort of invest in new types of automation technologies, whether it was back then on NFV and SDN, or it's now on agentic AI and some of the places we're going now with autonomous networks. The problem was sort of the same use case, although they've come a long way in those 10 years. It was, how do I take that cost I have in my operation and the agility that it might lack in a certain spots, and how do I solve for that? And I think that's the thing that Ciena viewed as a powerful thing to tackle, in correlation, not just with its selling large amounts of a very important optical equipment or routing and switching equipment, but also as an added value to the customer, saying, let us help you try and solve this operational challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I recall that being a big deal. And I, especially because the way that Blue Planet was described to me, I think back in the day, was that this was a way to figure out what your inventory was, talk to it, and then kind of translate, or sort of serve as a translator between the old network gear and then whatever the carrier was trying to do in the cloud or trying to do next, with virtualization and stuff like that. So, so that made sense. To step back a bit more, I think our audience would be interested in this, because everybody knows everybody in telecom. How does your career kind of line up with both Blue Planet as a division of Ciena and Ciena?
Yeah. Well, so I think if you look at my background, you'll see that I've spent almost my whole career in marketing. Actually, eventually becoming the CMO of Ciena. Going through that life cycle, and then the acquisition, and then moving over to Ciena, and then becoming the CMO of Ciena for many years. But I had a couple of stints at Ciena. I think I worked at the company after an acquisition in I think it was 2004, called Internet Photonics. So I've been acquired twice by Ciena. So I've done a number of startups, and one of those startups was Internet Photonics, and another one was Ciena. So I came into the company twice, but during those time periods, it was mostly in marketing roles. But I was left with a passion for solving the business problem that we just described in our previous conversation, which was, there will always be an appetite by the operators to purchase equipment as they refresh their network, or as speeds and feeds get faster and faster. And that's an organic piece of how our industry works, and we all get that. But this software, this complex software monolith that sat in the background, this BSS OSS machine, really hadn't been completely solved yet in terms of the cost that could be taken out. And as CMO, I continued to rotate into the conversation and say, how can we make that conversation better? How can we get it in front of our sales team? How can we talk about it for customers? And that passion for that topic eventually translated into the leadership team here at Ciena, and Gary Smith, obviously my boss, saying, okay, you seem really passionate about it. Why don't you grow it for me? So just, to make
reminder to everybody,
short,
do not speak up at work, or you will get more jobs.
I'm really passionate about Hawaii, but Phil still hasn't sent me there to lead.
Well, maybe you can speak up about that.
Maybe if I put it.
Well, I feel like, Kelsey, you've crossed the chasm. You've officially raised your voice.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no.
I'll go. I volunteer as tribute.
Can't wait to explain that to finance. Right. That makes sense. The software part of the telco world has been probably the slowest to evolve, and is now kind of the focal point because of partly a virtualization, but also just what carriers are expected to do now. They have to know not only so much about their network, but their customers are wanting
Yeah.
different kinds of capacity than they
Mm.
used to. Different kinds of measurements
Yeah.
are being applied to things like AI, and they're needing a lot of on-demand access and security. So
Yeah.
there's a real I think maybe more than ever a big need for that. Inside
Yeah.
of Blue Planet, obviously you guys have had a pretty successful run because we were just uh, in the quarterly results that just came out said that it was the highest revenue growth or I think it was highest
Yeah.
revenue in the quarter for the
Highest revenue quarter, and we're experiencing our fastest growth right now. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean contrast that with when the company was bought, when Cyan was bought. In Cyan's one of their annual reports, like just preceding that, it had said it's really interesting to go back and read that now because it was like we have this software, we don't really know how to price it. Um, we think it's incredibly valuable, but right
Yeah.
now we're just going to continue to sell it through our boxes. And
Yeah.
it was a really interesting kind of thing in the risk factors. It was kind of buried in there about how probably it
Yeah.
didn't say it exactly this way, but it was basically saying probably the most valuable asset in our future
Yeah.
is this software, but we just don't know how, what it costs or
That's
how
fascinating.
to
Yeah.
charge for it, or
Right.
and I think the risk factor associated with that, if you kind of like translate it into investor speak or whatever, was
Yeah.
all about if we don't get that part right, if we don't figure out how to charge for this stuff,
Yeah.
We might be undercutting or devaluing our hardware business, because that was the other
Sure.
sort of realization with virtualized networking was like, hey,
Yeah.
wait a minute, specialty hardware in
Yeah.
some cases might be going out the window.
Yeah. Yeah.
We might be able to do this stuff on more kind of straightforward computing platforms and things like
Right.
that.
Well, that was the concept behind NFV, right? It was your sort of white boxing. You're placing software on top of a white box or compute. And so that's where some of those risk factors came in. Like, hey, is the industry going to take a stance on hardware and software that devalues the hardware business? Blue Planet today is a fundamentally completely different narrative because the industry's focus changed a lot, and then we acquired a bunch of companies along the way that put us firmly in the space of actual OSS, operational automation, and it sort of changed the focus of the business. I think what service providers and CSPs and large operators are doing now is they're actually they've taken those concepts, they've moved beyond those original NFE. It's still important, but they've moved beyond those concepts largely. And they're now in the business of saying, I have a very large data set. This data set comes from many, many, many different sources. And in some cases, it's unstructured, in some cases, structured. But I cannot apply automation and agentic AI and all these technologies against that until it's organized. Until we get rid of all the complexity, until we collapse these apps down, until we get control of our operation. And the main thing that stood in their way, and I think this is a really important point, and one of the reasons Blue Planet was originally founded, was to disintermediate or change the industry's design point on how to build those systems. So if you look at how those systems are sort of constructed in the past, you had large systems integrators who we partner with, and they're great, but these very complex custom software programs where you had to build it's very customized. The whole concept behind Blue Planet, whether it's in the NFV era or now, was that we're trying to productize those things so that, every service provider's network's different. Phil and Kelsey, you're going to have customizations. Don't get me wrong, but we're trying to productize as much as possible so that the service provider doesn't feel they're beholden to these massive customizations. Mm-hmm. If they can get control of their data and get more productized software, then they can apply AI against it. Then they can get organized on the automation path. And that's what you hear today about autonomous networks and topics like that. That's the crux of what we're trying to tackle, and the evolution from where we were before to where we are now, just to sort of sync those two thoughts up.
Yeah, and you and I talked, I think back in June, a little bit about the move towards, increased use of agentic AI and how important it is to work with those service provider customers on federated inventory and ensuring that they have a clean pool of data. Can you talk a little bit about what that process was like? I think you said you spoke with some customers for about 6 to 8 months trying to work with that. And, going back a little bit too, to our discussion about how, there's certainly a lot of legacy operations in the OSS space as well. So.
Yeah, I mean, look, you have to give these guys an incredible amount of credit for building and tackling something really important to their business. They built DevOps teams. They understand the problem now, and they're actually embracing how they're going to go about it. Because there's sort of TM Forum has a piece of data that says if you can really tackle this, you have the opportunity to reduce your operational costs by, I think, 30 to 40%. So if you're operating under that assumption as you move toward an autonomous network, you have to say, okay, well, what do I need to do? What are the steps I need to do to get there? And that goes back to our conversation, Kelsey, where you say, okay, well, if inventory can be the single source of truth for what's in my network, what types of services across mobile, optical, routing, switching, whatever the case is, and then I have assurance data, so call that fault management, performance management data, and I connect those things. So now I know what's in my network, I know how it's performing, and I have a data set. Then I can say, hey, agent, I want to write an agent. It could be a Blue Planet agent. It could be, I could write my own agent. I want to democratize that process. Doesn't have to be through me. The old way of doing things would say, hey, it has to be me. You have to pay me. In Blue Planet's world, hey, if you want to write it, write it. If you want us to do it, we'll do it. But you write an agent against that data set, and that agent says, hey, I'm noticing that this problem is happening. What I'd like to do is reconfigure the network. And so because I have the single source of truth of what's in the network through the inventory stuff, which we talked about, I can now sort of with configuration management talk to the network and say, hey, reconfigure yourself a little bit so that we can avoid this problem. What I just described to you today is a very manual and costly process that sometimes requires many, many, many people and different systems being touched. So I gave you a little bit of a nirvana use case in some ways, but that's actually the path that they're trying, because that's where you get that 30% reduction in cost.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, it wasn't until I actually was touring networks kind of at the ground level before you kind of realize like how common it is that and how understandable it is that large telcos, especially ones that are the product of multiple acquisitions, have blind spots in their network. They have equipment that's up and running and operating and has been for years, but it might not be visible to someone sitting in an office with a dashboard looking at everything. But they know it's there. They're obviously, operating it. But like you were saying, it might be a very localized operation. It might be a very manual process, and so that data just doesn't make its way back. I'm kind of curious as to how far along telcos are tend to be in getting control of their inventory. Getting an action that, like you were saying, that holistic view, because it does. I have a question about agentic AI, but it does strike me that if you try to apply AI and you don't have all the data points, across the network, it's going to just be a smarter version of the very limited view you had before.
I think that's an incredibly insightful comment. That is the problem. We cannot as an industry afford to recreate the silos with AI that have existed for the last 30 years, because you're just changing the scope of the problem with a different technology. So, which is why I think one of the reasons Blue Planet's taking off now, going back to your comment earlier about our growth, is related to this very understanding you just described, which is take the Lumen program that we announced last year, where I think we're publicly stating, or they're talking about these 17 different inventory systems from different acquisitions that have to be federated and consolidated into one sort of source of truth. But they're not alone. We've got programs in many other places, and not just inventory programs, but assurance programs as well, that FM and PM data and orchestration. But the point is not about the wins. The point is about, what does it do for us as an industry? Can it actually, consolidate these, sort of clean the data? We have an expression: you can't AI what you can't see. So if you believe that that's true, then you actually have to get your house in order. So Phil, if the question is, are people tackling this? The answer is yes, because that's the basis of some of our growth right now. We're in the middle of some of those programs.
Interesting. Yeah. Lumen's a great example because they've been pretty upfront about where they came from, and if you just you can spend an afternoon going through their acquisition history and how vastly different some of those networks were, from one another, and then you have to kind of unite them all because of this, AI build out and the growth that's needed. So that's one that I follow closely because it is so. Such a monumental task and a very interesting one at that.
Very true.
How do you actually like what's the process of making a telco back office sort of more like applying agentic AI to that process? Like, what is it? Just in the interaction phase, with the network operator. So it's not a customer facing thing. It's definitely behind the scenes. But what is that? What kind of things does that help them to do?
Yeah. So there's two parts to the answer there, and I'll be brief. The first part is that when you look at the very progressive operators who are trying to tackle this problem, one important factor is that they have a belief system from the executive level that they need to tackle this. And that's what makes it work, because you have the whole organization aligned behind the effort. It's a little different in other implementations that we might have, let's say, where someone's trying to just replace a system or replace a use case, let's say assurance or whatever the case is. That's just tactically changing out an OSS application, which is great. And we love that business, don't get me wrong. But these major transformation projects are usually top-down driven big programs like we announced with Orange recently as well. So so that's the first sort of step. I know you're asking a question about agentic, but the first step is, do I want to take this journey? Do I want to tackle this data problem and tackle this from an organizational transformation standpoint? The answer is yes. Then you go to, well, what use cases am I trying to solve at some point with agentic? And so I hate to be not non-specific, but it's a little bit of the sky's the limit. What is your biggest business problem for your specific business is the answer to the question. So for instance, you might have had to write a massive line of custom code in the past to evaluate different sources of information in many different platforms. It cost you multiple millions of dollars to do that. And a systems integrator or someone, or your DevOps team would spend a lot of time making sure that was up to date, et cetera. Well, now at the end of this process, you might say, okay, let's go back to my configuration example that I used earlier. Now, when I sense a fault in the network, instead of having to go through all these steps and processes I described, I just want the agent to examine all of those processes that are going on, and that sits connected to the data model we were just talking about, and then make a decision, an automated decision. Now, I think that's the autonomous network view of how things are supposed to work. I think in the short term, Phil and Kelsey, the agent will make a decision and it'll go to somebody.
Mm-hmm. And that somebody will want to press that button to go, yes, let's apply that change, or let's hold off. Let me get
exactly. But I think that is a maybe multi-year process of faith building and trust building on these different agents that need to be built for these different types of use cases or problems. And then once that trust is built, that the system makes good choices, then you reduce the amount of human interactions over time. So I guess that's how I'd approach the answer. But there's lots of, you've got fault management, configuration management, you've got service delivery decisions you could make. Again, I hate to be rambling, but imagine an agent that says, hey, customer order just came in from the billing system. I want you to automatically provision this circuit, and the agent says, all the conditions are right, you can provision it. You don't have to ask somebody. All the conditions are right. That's another example.
I think that's the best takeaway too, for, especially as we're reporting on this, we kind of hear this over and over again. It's like the best possible use cases of any AI technology are going to come down to the most specific job you can describe. Like right now, it's not just this broad based, hey, fix my network. Like you were
Yeah, of
saying,
course.
it's got to have a business problem with a real,
Yeah.
efficiency issue in it that you can
Yeah.
kind of apply that technology for and have it look at.
And that will be unique, and that will be unique to and to the costs that an operator is dealing with, or where they sense the most pain. That's I think that's how they'll tackle it.
Yeah. And I think that's a good place to start to wrap it up. Can you talk a little bit in closing how big Blue Planet is now, and what do you see as coming in the near future? What's next for Blue Planet?
Well, Ciena is a publicly traded company, so I'm allowed to talk about what's officially announced from a earnings standpoint, et cetera. So we've had a good 3 quarters, and that's all available in our public.
But I just want to acknowledge personally that I know that as a marketing guy, that absolutely kills you. So
the marketing guy in me wants to shout from the rooftops, look at how good this thing is.
Right.
The GM in me is like, well, let me say.
Read our disclosures.
We've had a great few quarters, look, Ciena is a very large corporation. We're still a small business in the company, but the value of software, which is at a very high margin, is an important contribution to Ciena in general. So the size of the organization is not as important in some ways as the contribution of both for the customer value, the customers value what we're doing to help them, and number 2, the software revenue to the business from a gross margin standpoint. So from a business standpoint, in terms of Ciena and Blue Planet, that's why we're so focused heavily right now on trying to grow this business and lead to the future of trying to help our customers with this autonomous networks movement.
Sounds good. We'll leave it there for now. Joe Cumello, thanks so much for joining us, and congrats on the Blue Planet legacy. May it ever continue.
Kelsey, Phil, thanks a lot.